They thought she was just another child wandering the city alone. But when a 7-year-old girl walked into the lobby of one Vanderbilt clutching a wrinkled envelope, the words she whispered would stop a millionaire CEO in his tracks and alter the course of 3 lives forever. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the journey that unfolds across all 10 chapters. The lobby of one Vanderbilt was glass and steel, polished marble floors reflecting the soft February sunlight pouring in from Madison Avenue. Executives brushed past in tailored suits, their eyes fixed on phones and calendars, while security guards scanned every unfamiliar movement. The air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paper, New York City business at its most precise. And then came Ava Collins. She was too small for the cavernous space, her shoes scuffed, her coat 2 sizes too big. In her hands, she clutched a battered envelope, edges worn soft as fabric. She hesitated just beyond the revolving doors, her breath clouding in the cold air that followed her inside. Her mother's words replayed in her mind. "Take this letter to him. Don't let anyone else read it. If he doesn't listen, we may not have tomorrow." 7 years old, Mom, and she had never carried a burden so heavy. At that exact moment, Mason Whitfield stepped out of the elevators. 33 years old, founder and CEO of Whitfield Labs, he was a man accustomed to precision and control. His navy coat fit perfectly across his shoulders. His tie was the shade of deep midnight. He had risen from private school to MIT to biotech boardrooms with the efficiency of a man who never made mistakes. But as his gaze swept across the lobby, it snagged on something he did not expect. A pair of blue eyes staring up at him, wide and unblinking. They were startlingly familiar. His own eyes reflected back at him from a child's face. Ava swallowed, stepped forward, and raised the envelope with trembling hands. Her voice, when it came, was soft but certain. "Sir, can you read this letter? It's very important." The security guard moved instinctively, but Mason raised a hand, stopping him. Something in the girl's tone, steady, urgent, cut through the noise of business. Mason crouched to her level, accepting the envelope. The paper was creased, smudged with the fingerprints of a journey that had not been easy. His fingers unfolded the flap. Inside was a handwritten letter in neat, careful script. "Mason Whitfield, if you are reading this, I am asking for your help. My name is Rachel Collins. Years ago, our paths crossed, though you may not remember. What matters now is urgent. I am gravely ill. I have told my daughter Ava to bring you this letter because I no longer have the strength to come myself. If you do not come tonight, I may not survive the night at all. Rachel Collins." Mason read the final line twice. "If you do not come tonight, I may not survive the night at all." He looked back at the girl. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her knuckles white around the edge of her sleeve. "Where is your mother now?" Mason asked. Ava's lips quivered, but she answered clearly, "At home in Astoria. She can't get out of bed." Astoria. A cramped apartment across the East River, a world away from the glass towers of Midtown. Mason straightened slowly, the letter still open in his hands. Around them, the lobby continued to buzz with corporate rhythm, executives tapping on phones, assistants calling cars. But for Mason, the sound dimmed. Something unsettled shifted deep within him. For years, doctors had told him his own chances of fatherhood were non-existent. He had buried that disappointment beneath work, building a company that could outlast him. Yet here stood a girl with eyes like his, carrying a plea that threatened to shatter the walls he had built. Ava tugged his sleeve. "Will you come? Please. Mom said you're the only one who can help." The request was raw, unpolished. It carried no manipulation, only truth. Mason felt the weight of the city pressing down from 40 floors above, but the weight of a child's trust was heavier still. He folded the letter, slipping it into his breast pocket. "I'll come," he said quietly. Ava's shoulders loosened with visible relief. She exhaled as though holding her breath for days. As Mason signaled to his assistant, ordering a car toward Queens, his mind swirled. Why him? What had Rachel meant when she wrote "Our paths crossed"? And why, in the ink of desperation, had her hand still written his name as if she believed, without doubt, that he would answer? He looked down once more at Ava. Her coat sagged, her shoes nearly torn through, but her eyes held something most Wall Street boardrooms lacked, certainty in a future worth fighting for. And Mason, for the first time in years, felt his certainty begin to crack. The revolving doors opened again, ushering in another gust of February wind. But this time Mason didn't notice. He was already walking toward the unknown, led by the smallest guide he had ever followed, Ava Collins, and the fragile letter that might save her mother's life. Astoria was a different world from Midtown. Gone were the mirrored towers and polished sidewalks. Here, brick apartment blocks leaned against one another like weary shoulders, laundry lines sagging between fire escapes. The elevated train roared overhead as Mason's car pulled onto a narrow street. Ava pressed her forehead to the window, pointing. "That's our building." Mason stepped out onto the cracked pavement, the cold air biting sharper than it had in Manhattan. The stairwell smelled faintly of fried onions and damp concrete. He followed Ava up 3 flights, each step groaning under his weight, until they stopped before a peeling green door. Ava unlocked it with practiced fingers. "Mom, I'm back." The apartment was small, 2 rooms divided by a thin wall, the kind of place where every sound carried. A space heater hummed weakly in the corner. On the couch lay Rachel Collins. She was 31, though illness had carved her face into something older. Her skin was pale, lips tinged with blue, each breath shallow and effortful. A wool blanket covered her legs, but Mason noticed the swelling in her ankles, the telltale edema of a failing heart. Her eyes fluttered open. For a moment she did not recognize him, then widened with a flicker of disbelief. "Mason, you came." Her voice was hoarse, as if each word cost her. Mason pulled a chair closer. "You wrote the letter." Rachel nodded weakly. "I wasn't sure you'd read it." Ava climbed onto the couch beside her mother, tucking herself against her side. "I told him, Mom. I told him it was important." Mason studied Rachel closely. He had seen patients in hospitals during philanthropic visits, but this was different. The room carried no antiseptic scent, only stale air and the faint rasp of Rachel's lungs. Beside her lay a folder stuffed with papers, medical records, test results, prescriptions half filled. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the folder. Rachel nodded. Mason flipped through. Echocardiograms from 2 years earlier, discharge summaries, blood work. The words leapt at him. Severe mitral regurgitation, ruptured chordae tendineae, left ventricular ejection fraction 35%. He skimmed the notes. NYHA Class 4 symptoms, BNP elevated, urgent surgical intervention recommended. One report in bold. Optimal surgical window, immediate. Mason looked up. "Why haven't you had the surgery?" Rachel's eyes filled with a mixture of shame and exhaustion. "Insurance lapsed when I lost my job. Medicaid application, still pending. They gave me medication to hold on, but..." She coughed, a deep rattle that left her breathless, clutching her chest until Ava rubbed her back. Mason frowned. "This isn't sustainable. You need intervention, not just diuretics and beta blockers." "I know," Rachel's voice cracked, "but hospitals don't take IOUs, and Ava needed food more than I needed another test." The words hit Mason harder than he expected. He had signed billion-dollar contracts with a flick of a pen, but here was a woman trading her life against groceries and rent. He flipped another page. The last note read, "Pulmonary hypertension developing. Delaying repair risks irreversible changes." Ava tugged his sleeve. "Can you help her, please?" Mason hesitated. Questions stormed his mind. Why had Rachel written to him? What history connected them? Why did Ava's eyes mirror his own? But the answers could wait. The urgency of Rachel's failing heart could not. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number. "This is Mason Whitfield. I need an ambulance dispatched to Astoria, Queens, third-floor walk-up. Female, 31, severe mitral regurgitation. Decompensated heart failure." Rachel tried to protest. "No, we can't. You can't survive another night like this," Mason interrupted firmly. His voice was calm, but his chest tightened. He had negotiated mergers under impossible pressure, but this was different. Here, failure meant death, not for a balance sheet, but for the woman gasping before him. Within minutes, sirens wailed faintly in the distance. Ava clung to her mother, whispering reassurance. Mason stood near the window, eyes fixed on the flashing lights as the ambulance pulled up. 2 EMTs climbed the stairs, bringing with them the sharp scent of antiseptic. They checked Rachel's vitals, oxygen saturation dipping to the low 80s, blood pressure unstable. One slipped a nasal cannula into place, the other prepared a portable monitor. "She's unstable," one EMT muttered. "Needs cardiology consult stat." Mason leaned closer. "Mount Sinai Morningside. Book an echo in the morning, first slot. I'll cover everything." The EMT raised an eyebrow. "Family?" Mason hesitated. He glanced at Ava, who was staring at him with desperate hope, then back at Rachel. "Yes," he said finally. "Family." Rachel's eyes softened. She reached for his hand, her grip weak but warm. "Thank you," she whispered. As the EMTs wheeled her out, Mason gathered the folder of records, tucking it under his arm. Ava slipped her hand into his without hesitation, her small fingers clutching tightly. They stepped into the cold Astoria night together. For the first time in years, Mason felt unsteady, not from business risks or corporate battles, but from the weight of 2 lives now tied to his own. The ambulance doors closed, sirens cutting through the quiet street. Mason exhaled slowly, his reflection flashing in the window. A man who had just crossed a threshold he could never step back from. And deep inside, though he would not yet admit it aloud, the certainty grew. This was not just responsibility. It was the beginning of something he had been missing without knowing, the shape of a family forming out of desperation and courage. The emergency department at Mount Sinai smelled of antiseptic and urgency. Machines beeped in overlapping rhythms. Gurneys rolled past, each carrying a story suspended between hope and fear. Mason kept one hand on Ava's shoulder as they followed the paramedics into a curtained bay where Rachel was transferred from the stretcher to a narrow hospital bed. Her skin was clammy, her breathing shallow. A nurse clipped a pulse oximeter to her finger. The numbers flashed low, red. Another nurse hung an IV bag of furosemide, hoping to offload the fluid straining her lungs. "Hang in there, Mom," Ava whispered, clutching her mother's hand. Rachel turned her head weakly, eyes finding Mason. "You didn't have to come this far." "Yes, I did," Mason said, his voice quieter than he intended. A cardiology fellow entered with a stethoscope, listened briefly, then exchanged a glance with the attending. "Severe hollow systolic murmur radiating to the axilla. She needs a formal echo in the morning, but this is advanced." Mason already knew. He had read the reports, studied the faded numbers, but hearing it again, here, now, with Rachel pale under fluorescent light, tightened something in his chest. When the doctors left to arrange labs, Ava climbed onto the chair beside Rachel's bed. From her backpack, she pulled out a worn spiral notebook, its cover decorated with childish doodles of hearts and stars. She placed it carefully in Mason's lap. "This is proof," she said solemnly. Mason looked at the notebook, puzzled. "Proof of what?" "Proof of the heart," Ava said. She flipped open the pages. Inside were rows of careful block letters and sketches. On one page, a crude map of subway lines. N train, 7 train, shuttle, arrows between stations. Another page had diagrams of elevators and revolving doors. Each was labeled in Ava's uneven handwriting. "I practiced every route," Ava explained. "Mom said if something happened, I had to be brave enough to find you, so I wrote everything down so I wouldn't forget." Mason turned the pages slowly. Among the maps were words copied phonetically: mitral regurgitation, pulmonary hypertension, ejection fraction. Beside them, Ava had drawn pictures: a heart with arrows showing blood flowing backward, lungs shaded blue. "She taught me the words," Ava said, "so I'd know why she couldn't breathe." Mason swallowed hard. The notebook in his hands wasn't just paper. It was evidence of a 7-year-old who had shouldered responsibility no child should. Proof of Rachel's illness, yes, but also proof of Ava's fierce loyalty, her refusal to let her mother fight alone. Rachel stirred, eyes half open. "She carried that everywhere, said it made her brave." Mason placed a hand on the notebook. "It did more than that. It got her here. It got me here." The nurse returned with lab slips. BNP elevated, creatinine creeping higher, sodium low. Numbers that confirmed what Mason already felt. Rachel's body was running out of margin. They settled her for the night with oxygen and medication, but the air remained heavy with unspoken fears. Ava refused to leave her mother's side. She curled in the chair, notebook still clutched in her lap, eyelids finally sagging after the long day. Mason stood by the window, watching snowflakes fall past the hospital lights. His phone buzzed relentlessly, missed calls from board members, messages from Sabrina demanding explanations. But he silenced it. For once, the world of shareholders and quarterly reports seemed irrelevant. When Rachel dozed, Mason pulled the notebook from Ava's loose grip and studied it again. The subway maps, the words copied in a child's hand, the drawings of a heart struggling to beat. Proof of the heart, Ava had called it. He realized she wasn't just proving her mother's illness. She was proving courage, devotion, and trust. She was proving what family looked like when survival depended on it. Rachel stirred suddenly, her voice faint but clear. "I wrote to you because I thought, if anyone could move mountains, it was you." Mason leaned closer. "And what if I fail?" Her lips curved weakly. "Then at least you tried. That's more than most." He stayed at her bedside until dawn, Ava's small hand curled in his, Rachel's monitor tracing fragile hope in green lines. For the first time in years, Mason Whitfield felt that his life had stepped off the rails of profit and power and into something deeper, something measured not in billions, but in breaths. And when the first rays of morning touched the hospital windows, Mason whispered to himself the words Ava had written, proof of the heart. He understood now. It wasn't just a notebook. It was a command. Tomorrow, he would act. The morning light slanted across the Hudson as Manhattan stirred awake, but inside Mount Sinai, time was measured not in hours, but in heartbeats. Rachel had spent the night tethered to monitors, her breaths shallow but steadier on oxygen. Ava had refused to leave, dozing with her head on Mason's arm until the nurses came to wheel her mother down the corridor. "Where are they taking her?" Ava asked, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "For the echo," Mason said softly. "It's how they see her heart." The echocardiography lab was dim, the blinds drawn against the rising sun. Rachel lay on her side while a technician spread cool gel across her chest and pressed the probe gently against her ribs. The machine hummed, translating invisible sound into images. Mason stood near the monitor, watching the grayscale chambers pulse on the screen. The left atrium loomed larger than it should, a balloon stretched thin. Then the Doppler color overlay appeared, a jet of regurgitant blood flashing like a storm cloud across the valve. The technician exchanged a glance with the cardiology fellow. Dr. Anita Shah, a young attending with kind eyes, leaned closer. "This is significant." Rachel tried to smile, though her lips trembled. "Speak plain, doctor. Don't dress it up for me." Dr. Shah nodded, her tone calm but firm. "The valve between your left atrium and left ventricle is badly damaged. Blood is leaking backward each time your heart beats. That's why your lungs fill with fluid and why you can't catch your breath." She pointed to the screen. "See this bright streak? That's the regurgitation. It's severe. Your atrium is enlarged. Your pressures are rising. If we don't intervene soon, your heart muscle will weaken beyond recovery." Mason felt his stomach tighten. He had read the old reports, but this was no longer numbers on a page. It was Rachel's living heart, struggling in real time. Rachel's voice was barely audible. "What happens if we wait?" Dr. Shah didn't flinch. "Pulmonary edema, atrial fibrillation, right-sided failure, and once pulmonary hypertension becomes fixed, surgery won't reverse it." She softened her tone. "In other words, delay makes things dangerous. The window for optimal outcome is narrow." The words hung heavy. Ava gripped the side of the bed, her eyes wide. "So, how much time do we have?" Dr. Shah crouched to meet the girl's gaze. "Weeks, maybe. But the safest option is surgery as soon as possible." Ava nodded solemnly, as if filing the answer in her notebook. When the test ended, Rachel was wheeled back to her room. Mason walked beside her, his mind racing. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers, faced down hostile investors, but he had never felt urgency like this, the countdown of a failing heart. In the quiet of the room, Rachel reached for his hand. "I know what you're thinking, but surgery costs more than I'll ever see in a lifetime." Mason shook his head. "Don't say that. Money won't be the reason you don't get treated." Her eyes searched his. "Why are you doing this, after all these years?" He looked at Ava, sitting cross-legged on the chair, her notebook open to another drawing of a heart. "Because she carried your letter across the city. Because you asked me. Because some things matter more than the past." Rachel's lips quivered, but she said nothing. Her eyes closed, as if conserving the little strength she had. That afternoon, Dr. Shah returned with the full report. Severe primary mitral regurgitation, posterior leaflet flail, ruptured chordae, left atrial enlargement, pulmonary artery pressure elevated, EF borderline, 35%. She folded her hands. "The recommendation is surgical repair, ideally in the next 2 weeks." Rachel nodded weakly. Mason spoke before she could. "Schedule it. I'll take care of everything." Dr. Shah glanced between them, then wrote the order. "I'll consult our cardiothoracic team. Be prepared for risks. Any surgery of this magnitude carries them. But waiting is riskier still." When she left, Ava tugged Mason's sleeve. "You'll stay with her, right? Even if it's scary?" He crouched to eye level. "Every step of the way." She leaned into him, whispering, "Then she'll make it. I know she will." That night, The city glittered beyond the hospital windows, indifferent and vast. But Mason sat by Rachel's bed, holding Ava's hand on one side and Rachel's on the other. He had built his empire on certainty, on data, on control. Now he was learning that true power lay in something else, choosing not to look away. The echo had shown more than a failing valve. It had shown the truth of time slipping away. And Mason, for once, refused to let time win. The following morning, Mason arrived at Mount Sinai with 2 cups of coffee in hand. One for himself, black and bitter, and one for Rachel, though he doubted she would drink more than a sip. Ava had spent the night curled beside her mother, clutching her notebook as though it were a shield. Rachel smiled faintly when Mason entered. "You didn't have to come so early." "I couldn't stay away," he admitted. He placed the coffee on the tray. "Today, Dr. Patel wants to finalize her plan for surgery." Rachel nodded, though the movement cost her effort. She was paler than the day before, her breaths shallow. Ava looked up from her chair, eyes searching his face. "You'll be here, right?" "Always," he said. By mid-morning, a courier from a private clinic arrived. Mason frowned when the envelope was pressed into his hand. "What's this?" "Results requested by Ms. Sabrina Cole," the courier replied before leaving. Mason's jaw tightened. He hadn't asked for this, but Sabrina had. Against his better judgment, he opened the envelope. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore the stark, clinical words, "Probability of paternity, 0.0%. For a moment, the room tilted. His eyes scanned the line again, as though repetition might change its meaning. 0.0%. The verdict of science, delivered without compassion. Rachel noticed the color drain from his face. "What is it?" He handed her the paper. She read, her lips trembling. "No." She looked up, panic flickering in her tired eyes. "Mason, this can't be right." The door creaked open and, almost as if summoned by fate, Sabrina strode in. Perfectly tailored blazer, hair immaculate, her smile sharp as glass. "I thought you deserved the truth," she said smoothly. Mason's voice was low, dangerous. "You had no right." "I had every right," Sabrina countered. "I won't stand by while you throw away your reputation and this company for a child who isn't even yours." She tossed a folder onto the side table. "Recognize him?" "Elliot Barnes. Rachel's brief husband. They annulled it, but still, the timing speaks for itself." Rachel's face flushed with both shame and anger. "That marriage was nothing. It ended in weeks. Ava was born after—" She broke off, coughing violently, clutching her chest. Ava leapt to her side, frightened. "Mom!" Ava cried. Mason steadied Rachel until the fit subsided. His heart ached at the sight, yet the paper in his hand burned like ice. He looked at Ava, her eyes wide and blue, so like his own. Could coincidence explain that? Sabrina's voice sliced through his thoughts. "Look at the evidence, Mason. Numbers don't lie. Walk away before this destroys you." A nurse entered, sensing the tension. "Visiting hours are limited," she said firmly, ushering Sabrina toward the door. Sabrina left with a final smirk, her heels clicking like a gavel. When the door shut, silence pressed heavy. Rachel's voice cracked. "If you believe her, if you think Ava isn't yours, I understand. But don't punish her. Don't let her feel abandoned." Mason looked at the small girl gripping her mother's hand, trying to be brave. Ava whispered, "She said you're not my dad. But I know we have the same hands. See?" She lifted her palm against his. The shape was uncanny. The same long fingers, the same curve of the thumb. His throat tightened. He couldn't speak. Later that evening, Dr. Patel came by with updated labs. She sensed the tension but focused on her patient. Rachel's ejection fraction is falling. She's down to 30%. If we wait more than 2 or 3 weeks, pulmonary pressures may cross the threshold for irreversible damage. We need to move quickly. Mason stared at the report, the numbers stark against the white page. He had built his life on data, clinical trials, statistical significance, shareholder graphs. But for the first time, numbers left him hollow. Rachel closed her eyes, tears slipping free. Maybe this is my punishment. For mistakes, for pride. Maybe... Stop, Mason said sharply. Don't talk like that. She opened her eyes, searching his face. Then what do we do? He exhaled, long and heavy. We move forward. We fight. DNA be damned. Rachel's lips trembled into a smile of relief, though fragile. Ava clung to his arm, whispering, I knew you wouldn't leave. But as Mason walked out into the cold night air later, the paper still in his pocket, his mind churned. Something about the test gnawed at him. The speed of the results, the courier's evasive glance, Sabrina's too ready evidence. The scientist in him smelled contamination, tampering. The father in him, though, whether proven by genes or not, already knew the truth. And yet, the seed of doubt had been planted. It would take more than faith to uproot it. The paper in Mason's pocket weighed more than any balance sheet he had ever signed. Probability of paternity, 0.0%. It was supposed to end the debate. Instead, it ignited suspicion. By midnight, he was seated in the private office of Dr. Marcus Lee, director of genomic research at Weill Cornell. They had met as young men in Cambridge, both fueled by sleepless ambition. Now Marcus was one of the few people Mason trusted without question. You're telling me a private clinic produced this in less than 12 hours? Marcus frowned, pushing his glasses up the bridge of his nose. That's impossible for proper STR analysis. Even rapid PCR needs longer. Did they provide a full audit trail? Mason slid the report across the desk. Just the result. No log, no custody record. Marcus scanned the page, his mouth tightening. Sloppy, or deliberate. He typed quickly into his computer, pulling up a shared database of lab certifications. Here, this clinic filed a service interruption last night. Brief power outage during processing. Mason's pulse thudded. Could that affect results? Not unless someone wanted it to, Marcus said grimly. He clicked again, tracing call records logged automatically by the lab's internal system. And look at this. An unregistered incoming call during the custody gap. Cross-reference. He hesitated, then swiveled the screen toward Mason. It matches Sabrina Cole's cell number. The air left Mason's lungs in a rush. Anger flared, cold, sharp, undeniable. She bought the result. Marcus folded his hands. If you want truth, we retest. 2 independent labs. Dual swabs, sealed and witnessed. No shortcuts. Do it, Mason said. His voice carried the weight of decision. Tonight. At dawn, he returned to Mount Sinai. Ava was awake, her hair tangled, her notebook open on her lap. When Mason entered, she looked at him warily, as if bracing for abandonment. He crouched beside her chair. I owe you and your mom an apology. I doubted what should never have been doubted. That ends now. Her small hand slid into his. So you believe me? I believe in you, Mason said. And I believe in proof. We're going to do this again, the right way. That afternoon, Marcus arrived with 2 technicians and sterile kits. Ava studied the cotton swab suspiciously. Does it hurt? Not at all, Mason assured her. Like brushing your teeth. She opened her mouth bravely. Mason followed. Each sample was taken twice, sealed into tamper-proof envelopes, signatures scrawled across every seam. One set destined for Weill Cornell, another for Columbia University. Chain of custody documented at every step. Ava peered at the evidence tape, curiosity outweighing fear. Now nobody can mess it up? Not this time, Marcus confirmed. The truth will stand. When it was done, Mason turned to Rachel. She had watched silently, exhaustion etching shadows beneath her eyes. He reached for her hand. Whatever the result, it changes nothing. You'll have the surgery. You'll have the care you need. I'm funding it personally. Her lips parted, a tremulous protest on the edge, but he cut it off gently. No arguments. Your window is closing. We act now. Tears pooled at the corners of her eyes. She squeezed his hand once, fiercely, before turning away to hide the emotion. That night, Mason drafted the authorization papers. His lawyers balked at the personal liability. He overrode them with a single line. This is not a transaction. It is a commitment. Meanwhile, across Midtown, Sabrina was orchestrating a different kind of operation. She stood at the head of the Whitfield Labs boardroom, voice sharp, eyes glittering. Our CEO has abandoned his duties to chase a scandal. A dying woman, an alleged child, whispers of illegitimacy. If the press learns before we contain this, shareholder trust collapses. I propose interim leadership until Mason clarifies his position. Some board members shifted uneasily. Others nodded. The word risk echoed like a mantra. Sabrina smiled, satisfied. Mason Whitfield was losing control of his company, his reputation, his empire. But Sabrina underestimated the man she sought to replace. Mason was no longer fighting for numbers or optics. He was fighting for a girl who had crossed the city with a letter and for the mother whose heart still clung to life. And when Mason fought for something human, he was unstoppable. The next morning, he sat at Rachel's bedside, Ava curled beside him. The results will take a few days, he said. But your surgery won't wait. Patel's team is preparing the schedule. We're moving forward. Rachel nodded weakly, relief and fear entwined. Ava looked at him with steady eyes. Then you'll stay? Mason met her gaze, firm. I'll stay. Outside the window, dawn broke over Manhattan. For once, Mason didn't see skyscrapers or profit margins. He saw a new chain forming, not of custody, but of trust. A chain that would not break again. The morning of surgery arrived cold and gray, a hush over Manhattan that felt almost ceremonial. At Mount Sinai, Rachel lay prepped in the cardiac unit, IV lines trailing, monitors mapping every fragile beat. Ava sat at her side, gripping her hand, whispering stories from her notebook as though words alone could anchor her mother. Mason stood near the bed, suit replaced with hospital scrubs, cap in his hand. He had spent the night in a chair outside the unit, unable to leave, unwilling to miss a moment. Now, as the surgical team gathered, he leaned down to Rachel. You'll come back to us, he said firmly. Rachel tried to smile. Promise me. Whatever happens, don't let her feel alone. You don't have to worry about that, Mason answered. Not anymore. Ava pressed her face into Rachel's arm. I'll be right here, Mom. When you wake up, I'll read you the story about the swans in Central Park. Dr. Karen Patel entered, her scrubs crisp, her eyes steady. It's time. They wheeled Rachel away. Mason and Ava followed until the double doors closed, then sat together in the waiting room, hours, stretching like years. Mason tried to distract her with tic-tac-toe, with cups of hot chocolate, with stories from his childhood. But her gaze kept darting toward the board where the surgical status updated. Incision, bypass, valve exposure. Finally, mitral valve repair attempted. Mason held his breath. Minutes ticked. Then, annuloplasty ring placed, artificial chordae secured. 5 hours later, Dr. Patel appeared, exhaustion etched across her features, but relief lighting her voice. The surgery went well. We repaired the valve, anchored the ruptured chordae, reshaped the annulus. Intraoperative echo showed only trace regurgitation. Her pulmonary pressures are already dropping. Mason exhaled, shoulders sagging with release. Ava jumped up, tears streaming. So she's going to be okay? With rehab and medication, yes, Patel said warmly. We've given her heart another chance. When they were allowed into recovery, Rachel lay pale but alive, chest rising in steady rhythm. Tubes and monitors surrounded her, but her breaths no longer fought for space. Ava clambered carefully onto the bed, curling beside her mother, whispering, "I knew you'd come back." Rachel stirred, eyes fluttering open. "Ava? Mason?" Her voice was hoarse, but her smile was radiant. Mason sat, taking her free hand. "You're safe now. The valve is fixed. The worst is behind us." Rachel's lips trembled. "Thank you." That night, as Rachel slept under sedation, Marcus Lee arrived carrying 2 sealed envelopes. He drew Mason into the corridor, his face unreadable. Both labs completed their analysis. Chain of custody intact, no irregularities. Mason's throat tightened. "And?" Marcus handed him the envelope. Mason tore it open, his eyes scanning the lines. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. For a moment he couldn't breathe. The world blurred, then sharpened with clarity. All the suspicion, the false reports, Sabrina's manipulations, dispelled in one line of scientific truth. Marcus placed a hand on his shoulder. "It was never in doubt, Mason. Not really." Mason returned to the room. Ava was half asleep in a chair, her notebook slipping from her lap. He crouched beside her, brushing her hair gently. "Ava," he whispered. She blinked, rubbing her eyes. "Is Mom okay?" "She's okay," Mason said. He hesitated, then added softly, "And so are we." The test came back. "You're my daughter." Her eyes widened, filling with tears. "Really?" "Really." His voice broke. "You were right all along." She threw her arms around his neck, clinging fiercely. "I knew it! I knew it!" Rachel stirred at the sound, opening her eyes just enough to see them. Her lips curved in the faintest smile before she drifted back into healing sleep. Mason held Ava, the weight of certainty settling not as a burden, but as a gift. For years, he had lived convinced he could never have children. That legacy was something built only in boardrooms and balance sheets. Now, here was his daughter, flesh, blood, heart, holding him as though she had always known. The following morning, Mason read aloud to Rachel in recovery. His voice was low, steady, the story more for comfort than for meaning. Ava perched on the bed, tracing her mother's bandaged hand with small fingers. Together they formed a tableau of survival, fragile, imperfect, but undeniable. Later that afternoon, Mason's attorney called. "We have confirmation of tampering by Sabrina," the technician confessed. "We'll press charges." Mason glanced at Rachel, then at Ava. "Do it," he said. "But quietly. This isn't about revenge. It's about making sure no one else is ever hurt like this." That night, as snow fell lightly over Manhattan, Mason sat by the window of Rachel's room. He listened to the steady beep of her heart monitor, the sound once terrifying, but now a lullaby. Ava slept curled in a chair, her notebook clutched against her chest. Mason looked at them both. His family. At last, the truth was settled, not just in science, but in love. And for the first time in years, Mason Whitfield allowed himself to believe in tomorrow. Snow still clung to the edges of Central Park when Mason walked back into the glass tower of Whitfield Labs. It had been weeks since he'd last set foot in the boardroom. Now, stepping onto the polished marble floors, he felt less like a CEO returning to duty and more like a man entering the court of judgment. Executives whispered as he passed. Rumors had spread about Rachel, about Ava, about the surgery, and the scandal. Some voices were skeptical, others sympathetic. All fell silent when Mason opened the doors of the boardroom. Sabrina Cole was already there, seated at the far end of the long mahogany table, dressed in a steel-gray blazer, every detail calculated. She looked up with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mason, at last." He placed a folder on the table and slid it across. "Evidence," he said simply. "Phone logs, chain of custody reports, signed confession from a technician. You bribed him to alter the DNA results." The board members stiffened. One director opened the folder, scanning quickly, his eyes widening. Another murmured, "This is criminal tampering." Sabrina laughed softly, though the sound rang brittle. "And you expect them to believe this? That I, Chief Strategy Officer, risked prison just to keep you from playing house with some woman and her child?" Marcus Lee stepped into the room, his presence quiet but commanding. "It's not belief, it's science." He set another envelope on the table, results from Columbia and Weill Cornell, independently verified. "Ava is Mason's daughter. The false report was yours." For the first time, Sabrina's poise faltered, her jaw clenched, eyes darting across the table. Mason's voice cut through the silence. "Effective immediately, you are terminated. Security will escort you out." "You can't," she began, rising to her feet. "I can, and I will." Mason's tone was flat, cold steel. "Whitfield Labs was built on trust. You violated that trust, not just with me, but with the science we serve. That is unforgivable." Two security officers stepped forward. Sabrina's heels clicked sharply against the floor as she gathered her bag and stormed out, fury radiating in her wake. The door slammed behind her, leaving only silence. Mason turned to the board. "I've spent years chasing numbers, profit margins, market share. But last month I sat in a hospital waiting room, watching a little girl wonder if her mother would live to see another sunrise. That changes a man. It changed me." He pressed a button on the remote. The screen at the head of the table lit up with the words, "Astoria Children's Mitral Fund." "This fund will cover surgical costs for children with valve defects whose families cannot afford treatment," Mason continued. "Rachel Collins is our first patient, but she won't be the last. Every dollar will be transparent, audited, and reported publicly. If Whitfield Labs is to stand for anything, let it be this: healing." For a moment, the room was silent. Then a director, an older woman who had been skeptical of Mason for years, spoke softly. "Perhaps this is the best strategy we've had in a decade." Nods followed, murmurs of agreement. The tide had turned. That afternoon, Mason returned to Mount Sinai. Rachel was propped against pillows, color slowly returning to her cheeks. Ava sat cross-legged at the foot of the bed, drawing a picture of 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a giant red heart. Mason kissed Rachel's forehead. "It's done. Sabrina is gone." Rachel's eyes searched his. "And the board?" "They're behind us. Behind the fund." He pulled out the brochure mock-up, laying it on the blanket. The first 10 surgeries are already funded. Tears filled Rachel's eyes. She touched the page gently, as though it were fragile. You turned betrayal into something good. Mason shook his head. You did. You and Ava reminded me what good looks like. That evening, a press release went live. Whitfield Labs launches Children's Heart Fund after CEO exposes evidence tampering. Headlines spread across media outlets, not of scandal, but of redemption. The narrative had shifted. Later, as night settled, Mason sat in the quiet of Rachel's hospital room. Ava had fallen asleep curled beside her mother, their hands intertwined. Rachel looked at him with a softness that steadied his heart. She asked me something today, Mason said quietly. Rachel tilted her head. What? She asked if now that I'm her father, I'll live with you both. Rachel laughed weakly, shaking her head. What did you tell her? That I don't know how to live any other way anymore. His voice softened. But only if you'll have me. Her hand reached across the blanket, finding his. We've lived too long on borrowed breaths. Maybe it's time to learn what a real life feels like. Together. Mason threaded his fingers through hers. For the first time in years, he felt whole. And outside the hospital window, New York shimmered, a city of ambition, yes, but also of second chances. The moving truck groaned away from West 86th Street, leaving the air scented with cardboard and winter. Mason stood on the sidewalk with Rachel's arm looped through his, feeling the cautious weight of her recovery and the unguarded lightness of Ava skipping ahead. The building rose in warm stone and carved lintels, a small pocket of history staring out at the Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Reservoir. This is ours? Ava asked, breath fogging the glass of the entry door. Ours, Mason said, and the word rang through him like a bell, less a claim than a promise. The doorman, Mr. Alvarez, held the door and tipped his cap. Welcome home, he said, as if the phrase were an incantation. Upstairs, they opened onto a bright apartment with creaking floors and tall windows. The park looked close enough to touch, a quilt of silver water and dark branches stitched by the paths they'd soon learn by heart. Ava sprinted from room to room. This one's for drawings. This one's for forts. This one's for pancakes. Pancakes don't need a room, Mason said, but Rachel caught his eye with a smile that said, let her map this kingdom. Let her make it safe. In the kitchen, Mason lifted a small frame from a box and hung it above the table. The wrinkled letter Ava had carried across Midtown. Its paper looked unassuming against the paint, but the room shifted around it, as if 4 walls had agreed that this was the house's true cornerstone. Rachel traced the glass with one fingertip. I thought it would live in a drawer. It doesn't belong in the dark, Mason said. Nothing that brave does. They fell in daze, into a quiet rhythm that didn't announce itself so much as arrive. Soft morning light on bowls and mugs, coats shrugged on and off, socks lost beneath couches, the small friction of 3 people learning each other's edges, and the softer pleasure of smoothing them. Rachel's strength grew not with fanfare but with repetition, a little more each walk, a little less each pause to catch her breath. No one recited numbers. No one needed to. The proof was in the way she laughed more easily after dinner, or how Ava forgot to hover when her mother climbed a single flight of stairs without stopping. Rehab became a place of familiar nods and practiced encouragements. On days Mason could come, he stood in the back and let the simple heroism of treadmills and measured steps undo him quietly. Rachel liked to tease him afterward. You look at me like I invented walking. And he'd answer, some days you do. At home, they made an altar of the ordinary. Ava taped school art along one wall in a tide of color. Mason learned the ritual of a 7-year-old's bedtime. The negotiation of one more page, the final sip of water, the way questions with big teeth arrive in a whisper when the lights go out. "Are you leaving tonight?" she asked once. "No," he said. "I'm staying." "Even if the phone is loud?" "Even then." "And in the morning?" "And in the morning." She accepted this with the gravity of a treaty, sliding her hand into his, then falling asleep before she could decide whether to let go. Rachel watched them from the doorway, hair pulled into an easy knot, a softness at the edges of her smile that hadn't been there in the hospital. Later, when Ava slept and the apartment settled, they stood at the window together, the park spread below like a breathing thing. "I used to look at those paths and think they belonged to other people," she said. "They're ours now," Mason answered. "Not to sprint," she said. "To stroll." "To stroll," he agreed. Spring shouldered winter aside with the impatience of New York seasons. Crocuses pushed their purple flags through damp soil. The reservoir shrugged off its last brittle plates of ice. One Saturday, Ava presented a hand-drawn certificate, sealed with stars and a lopsided heart. "This certifies Mom's graduation walk around the reservoir." "Official," Mason said, solemn as a judge. "Binding," Rachel replied. They dressed in layers and took the loop at a patient pace. Joggers split around them like water around a rock. Ava narrated the world. The goose with the crooked foot, the runner with the neon hat, the dog that looked like a loofah. Rachel's hand in Mason's felt warmer than the air should have allowed. When they paused at the railing, she leaned on the cold metal and closed her eyes, face turned to the sun as if to drink it. "I want to remember this exact air," she said. "You will," he told her. They finished the circuit. No medals, no trumpets, just 3 sets of footprints and Ava declaring, "Family parade successful," which felt better than laurels. Back home, the apartment took on the afterglow of a small, honest triumph. Ava taped the certificate to the refrigerator with 3 strips of blue painter's tape and added a caption beneath in bold purple, "Proof of the heart." "Your handwriting's getting steadier," Rachel said. "So is yours," Ava answered. And the 3 of them stood in front of the humming fridge like museum-goers admiring a masterpiece. It was on an ordinary afternoon, after dishes, before homework, that Mason found himself in the bedroom with a small velvet box in his pocket and a question in his throat. He had rehearsed this moment in rooms with better lighting and fancier chairs, but rehearsal, he realized, had never met Rachel. He waited instead for the day to make its quiet case. They played Uno at the table and let Ava cheat by accident. They folded laundry into lopsided towers. Rachel paused midway through making tea, fingertips resting lightly on the counter, and said, almost to herself, "I like the sound of our house." "Which one?" Mason asked. "The tick of the vent? The upstairs neighbor's opera? The fork drawer that never opens on the first try?" "All of it," she said. "Even the stubborn parts." They walked, toward evening, back to the reservoir. The path wore its familiar width. The water held a late sun like a secret it was learning to trust them with. Mason's heart beat at an unhelpful volume. Ava darted ahead and then fell back, little comet with a wobbly tail. "Picture time," she declared, seizing their hands and arranging them by the railing. "Okay, now look like you're thinking of pancakes." "Why pancakes?" Mason asked. "Because pancakes are the best." He couldn't argue. He also couldn't wait any longer. He went down on one knee, the old wood of the boardwalk giving a sympathetic creak. Rachel's breath caught, but not in the way that used to worry him. "You could do this at home," she whispered, eyes bright. "I thought of that," he said. "But this is where we all learned how to keep going in a circle without giving up." He looked at Ava. "Assistant?" Ava had the box ready as if she had rehearsed with the universe. She opened it, cradling it in both hands like a bird. "Mom," she said, solemn and radiant, "will you marry my dad?" Rachel's laugh broke into tears mid-flight. She reached for Ava first, then for Mason, gathering them both as if the right answer required the correct radius. "Yes," she said, to the water, to the sky, to the stubborn city and the soft evening and the years behind and the years ahead. Yes. For a long, easy minute, there was nothing to do except breathe and let passers-by smile the private public New York smiles reserved for street musicians who get the high note and strangers who say yes at the edge of a lake. They walked home slow. The doorman said, "Evening, Whitfields," and no one corrected him. In the elevator, Ava practiced being a flower girl with invisible petals. In the kitchen, Rachel placed the ring on the counter for a second as if to test its gravity and then slid it back on, as if to test hers. They made dinner with ridiculous care. Over-buttered toast, eggs that insisted on being scrambled, strawberries that tasted more of hope than of fruit. Later, after Ava fell asleep mid-sentence with a marker uncapped like a tiny flag of surrender, Mason and Rachel stood again at the window. "You didn't promise me perfection," she said. "I can't," he answered. "But I can promise presents. Pancakes on Sundays." Too much cinnamon sometimes. The kind of quiet that's earned, not empty. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You already are." Below them, the park was a dark artery threaded with moving lights. Somewhere a siren sang its one-note hymn. Somewhere a saxophone bled through an open window. Somewhere in their home, the framed letter watched over dishes and crayons and a life that had learned to be tender without apology. Ava stirred and padded into the living room, hair like a flag, blanket like a cape. "I forgot to ask," she said, climbing into Rachel's lap and stealing half of Mason's shoulder. "Now that you're engaged, do we get extra pancakes?" "Scientifically," Mason said, "yes." "Legally," Rachel added, "we might be obliged?" Ava considered this, satisfied. "Good, because I drew a menu." She unfolded a page from her notebook. At the top, in purple, she had written, "Menu for Sundays." Beneath, a list. Pancakes, blueberries, more pancakes, one more pancake if we share nicely. At the bottom, the title she kept giving back to them as if she were tucking in a blanket. Proof of the heart. Mason kissed the top of her head. "That's binding," he said. "Binding," Rachel echoed. And the word felt right in her mouth, soft where it touched the edges, strong where it held. They turned off lamps until only the city was left to light the room. The ring flashed once and settled. On the wall, the letter glowed faintly in the streetlight, the handwriting that had asked for help now witnessing the answer. No one mentioned hospitals. No one recited outcomes. They didn't need to. Healing, here, was a set table, a shared blanket, 3 toothbrushes in a cup, the echo of 3 footsteps heading, without hurry, toward bed. Outside, the reservoir breathed. Inside, the apartment did too. And if a life could be measured in the quiet between heartbeats, then this was abundance, the hush before sleep, the long inhale of belonging, the exhale that said, without spectacle, we are home. The gates of the conservatory garden opened to spring itself. Rows of tulips blazed scarlet and gold. The lilac trees perfumed the breeze, and the fountain murmured with a rhythm older than the city. It was no cathedral, no ballroom. It was gentler, truer, a place where vows could take root in the soil as well as in the heart. Rachel paused at the garden's entrance. Her dress was ivory cotton, simple, sleeveless, swaying in the mild air. For the first time in years, she moved without counting steps, without fear of collapse. Beside her, Ava clutched a basket of petals, serious in her role but radiant with anticipation. "Are you nervous, Mom?" Ava whispered. Rachel smiled, brushing her daughter's hair back. "Only a little." "Good. Dad's way more nervous." Rachel laughed softly. "Then we'll keep him waiting no longer." At the arch woven with ivy and white roses, Mason stood in a tailored suit that looked almost plain compared to the man who once graced magazine covers. Today, there was no performance, no boardroom steel in his posture, only a man who had learned to stand still for love. When he caught sight of Rachel and Ava, his throat worked, as though language had deserted him. The guests rose. They were not many. Dr. Patel, who had stitched Rachel's valve with a surgeon's precision and a sister's care. Marcus Lee, who had restored truth when deceit nearly broke them. A handful of friends, a few neighbors. Enough to witness. Enough to hold this fragile, fierce moment. Ava scattered petals in determined handfuls, then darted to Mason's side. "Don't faint," she stage whispered, tugging his sleeve. "Mom doesn't want messy drama." Mason grinned, and laughter rippled through the chairs. When Rachel reached him, he took her hands, steadying them in his own. The officiant spoke briefly, words about commitment and second chances, but the vows belonged to them. Mason's voice was low, unguarded. "I lived half a life, mistaking achievement for meaning. Then a 7-year-old girl placed a wrinkled letter in my hands, and everything rearranged itself. Rachel, you and Ava gave me back what I didn't even know I was missing, a family. I vow to protect this gift with all I am." Rachel's eyes shone, her voice trembling. "I thought my heart was too broken, medically, emotionally, irreparably. But you saw past weakness. You stood with me in every breathless night, every uncertain morning. Mason, you and Ava have turned fear into joy. I vow to walk beside you for however long my heart is given." The officiant nodded. "And Ava has something prepared." Ava marched forward, unfolding a sheet of paper scribbled in purple crayon. She read slowly, but with the authority of someone who knew the words mattered. "When Mom couldn't breathe, I brought the letter. When her heart was fixed, I got a dad. Today I get both. So I promise to share toys sometimes, and to always remind you about pancakes on Sundays. That's my vow." The garden melted into tears and laughter all at once. Mason slid a ring onto Rachel's finger. "With this ring, I choose us, forever." Rachel placed a simple band on his hand. "With this ring, I say yes again, every day." Their kiss was soft, but unshakable. Applause rose like wind through trees, and Ava wrapped her arms around both of them, declaring, "Now it's official." Afterward, there was no grand reception, only a long wooden table beneath the lilacs, platters of fruit, sandwiches, sparkling water in mason jars. Children chased one another across the grass. Neighbors toasted with simple words, to health, to family, to proof of the heart. Later, Mason led Rachel to a bench near the fountain. He handed her an envelope. Inside, the latest report: ejection fraction, approximately 50%. Mitral regurgitation, mild. Clinical status, stable. Rachel's hand trembled. "It feels like a miracle." "It feels like you," Mason said, cupping her cheek. "You fought, you healed, and we're here." Ava bounded over, lemonade in hand. "Dr. Patel says your heart is like a drum, Mom. Boom, 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 boom. I can hear it when I hug you." Rachel pulled her daughter close, laughter and tears mingling. "Then may it never stop." As twilight fell, fairy lights strung through the trees flickered on, gilding the garden in gold. Mason, Rachel, and Ava stood beneath the arch once more, their silhouettes bound together. For Mason, the old cadence of life had been stock tickers and meetings. Now, it was Rachel's even breaths, Ava's small hand in his, the steady rhythm of love echoing in repaired chambers. The city beyond roared as always, But here, in the hush of blooming flowers and whispered promises, a new heartbeat began. Not just Rachel's mended one, but the family's, stronger, steadier, unstoppable. They walked out through the gates, hand in hand, leaving the garden behind but carrying its rhythm forward. And with every step, every laugh, every quiet Sunday morning to come, they chose the miracle again. Thank you for staying with us until the very last heartbeat of this story. If this journey of love, healing, and second chances touched your heart, please subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Together, let's keep sharing stories that remind us miracles are real when compassion leads the way.